When racial profiling meets rank, two officers learn the hardest lesson of their careers. They saw a black man running in an affluent neighborhood. They didn't expect him to be their boss. Subscribe to the channel and follow along to see how this powerful story unfolds. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Marcus Washington had been running these same suburban streets for the past 15 years. At 52, he took pride in maintaining his fitness, usually jogging for an hour each evening after work. The well-maintained neighborhood, with its manicured lawns and modern homes, had been his home since he first made captain. The streetlights were just beginning to flicker on as dusk settled over the quiet community. Wearing his usual grey running shorts and navy moisture-wicking shirt, Marcus kept a steady pace along the familiar route. The wireless earbuds played his favourite jazz playlist, helping him maintain rhythm as his running shoes hit the pavement in a consistent pattern. He nodded politely to Mrs. Henderson watering her roses, just as he had done hundreds of times before. Officers James Brady and Mike Sullivan were working their usual evening patrol in the affluent Oak Ridge district. Brady, a 12-year veteran with greying temples, had been training Sullivan for the past 3 months. The rookie officer was eager to prove himself, perhaps too eager, taking pride in what he called his street instincts. When they first passed Marcus jogging along Cedar Lane, Brady's eyes narrowed in the rearview mirror. Without a word, he executed a slow U-turn, ignoring Sullivan's questioning glance. The patrol car crept alongside the jogger, both officers watching intently through their windows. "Doesn't look like he belongs here," Brady muttered, his voice carrying years of ingrained prejudice. "Let's check him out." The police cruiser's tires crunched softly against the asphalt as it pulled alongside Marcus, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn of the Peterson house. Marcus maintained his steady jogging pace, but removed his right earbud, his muscles tensing almost imperceptibly, a reaction born from years of similar encounters. The jazz music playing in his remaining earbud, Miles Davis's "So What," created an almost surreal soundtrack to what he knew was coming. His heart rate barely fluctuated. After 27 years in law enforcement and 48 years as a black man in America, these moments had become dishearteningly familiar. Officer Brady's voice cut through the evening air with practiced authority, that particular tone that Marcus had heard countless times before, both as a civilian and as a law enforcement officer himself. "Sir, stop right there!" The command carried the weight of assumed authority, tinged with an undertone of suspicion that Marcus had learned to recognize since his teenage years in Memphis. He could already read the situation like a book he'd reviewed 100 times. The officers saw a black man in an affluent neighborhood and had already written their own story about why he was there. Coming to a controlled stop, Marcus positioned himself at a careful angle to the patrol car, making sure both officers had a clear view of his hands. The streetlight above cast enough illumination to eliminate any ambiguity about his movements. His running shoes planted firmly on the sidewalk, he kept his breathing steady and controlled, despite having just completed his 3rd mile. The evening air had grown cooler, and a slight breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass from the neighboring yards. Yards he passed every single day, belonging to neighbors who knew him by name. Officer Sullivan emerged first from the passenger side, his rookie eagerness evident in his slightly too aggressive stance. Marcus noticed how the young officer's hand hovered near his holster, a gesture that might seem casual to some, but spoke volumes to anyone familiar with police training. Brady followed more slowly from the driver's side, his movements deliberate and practiced, positioning himself slightly behind his partner, but with a clear line of sight. Their choreography was textbook, exactly as Marcus himself had once trained officers to do, though he'd always emphasized the importance of reading situations before escalating them. The porch lights of nearby homes began clicking on, one by one, as if the neighborhood itself was awakening to witness the scene. Marcus could see Mrs. Henderson through her front window, phone in hand, likely ready to call someone if needed. She had been his neighbor for 12 years, but from her anxious expression, he wondered if she recognized him in this context, or if the presence of police cars had transformed him in her eyes from Marcus the neighbor to suspicious black male. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," Brady announced, his voice carrying that familiar mix of authority and condescension that made Marcus's jaw tighten slightly. The veteran officer's eyes scanned Marcus's athletic wear, lingering a bit too long on his expensive running shoes, as if trying to reconcile their quality with his preconceptions. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Marcus kept his voice level and professional, drawing on decades of experience on both sides of this equation. "I'm jogging," he replied, maintaining eye contact with both officers while keeping his hands visible at waist level. "As I do every evening." He deliberately emphasized the last part, though he knew from experience that such context rarely mattered in these situations. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had helped write the department's current community policing guidelines, which these officers were systematically ignoring. Sullivan, perhaps feeling the need to assert his authority, stepped forward with the overconfidence typical of rookie officers. "Let's see some ID," he demanded, his voice carrying a slight tremor that Marcus recognized as nervous energy rather than fear. The young officer was trying to sound more confident than he felt, a common trait among new police that often led to unnecessary escalation. "May I reach for my wallet?" Marcus asked, following the script that he had learned long before he ever put on a badge himself. His question was both a courtesy and a subtle reminder to the officers of proper procedure, asking permission before making any movements that might be misinterpreted. He could see Sullivan's hand tense near his weapon, and for a moment, Marcus felt the full weight of the situation's absurdity. Here he was, the chief of police, having to navigate the same dangerous waters that had claimed too many black lives over the years. The cool leather of his wallet felt familiar in his hands as he slowly retrieved it from his running shorts. The motion was deliberate, practiced, almost theatrical in its caution. As he withdrew his department ID, he noticed a car slowing down as it passed the scene. The driver, one of his son's high school teachers, did a double take before reluctantly driving on. Another witness to another moment that shouldn't be happening in a neighborhood where Marcus had lived longer than either of these officers had worn a badge. The department ID caught the gleam of the streetlight as he handed it over, and Marcus watched their faces carefully. He had seen this moment of recognition hundreds of times before, during ceremonies, department meetings, and official functions. But this time was different. This time, the recognition would come with the sudden, crushing realization of their mistake, and, hopefully, a lesson that would stick with them longer than any diversity training seminar ever could. The evening had grown quieter, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, breaking the tension momentarily. Marcus stood perfectly still, letting the moment stretch out, allowing these officers to fully absorb the gravity of their actions. In the morning, this would become a teaching moment, but for now he wanted them to feel the full weight of their prejudices and assumptions. Under the harsh glare of the streetlight, Officer Brady's fingers trembled slightly as he held the department ID card. The glossy surface reflected the amber glow, clearly showing the photo of Marcus Washington, Chief of Police, the gold badge emblem embossed in the corner catching the light. The transformation that came over Brady's face was remarkable, like watching a fortress of certainty crumble into ruins of realization. His weathered features, which moments ago had projected such authority, now seemed to age years in seconds as the blood drained from his face. Officer Sullivan, still maintaining his aggressive stance, noticed his partner's sudden change in demeanor. Curiosity got the better of him, and he shifted position to peek at the ID card. The sharp intake of breath that followed was audible in the evening quiet. His hand, which had been hovering near his holster, dropped limply to his side, as if all the strength had suddenly left it. The rookie's face cycled through a range of emotions: confusion, recognition, horror, and finally a deep, burning shame that colored his cheeks bright red against the pale evening light. "Chief Washington?" Brady stammered, suddenly standing ramrod straight, his entire body language transforming from authoritative to subordinate in a heartbeat. The ID card shook visibly in his hand, and he had to use both hands to return it to Marcus without dropping it. "Sir, we didn't..." His voice trailed off, unable to find words that could possibly salvage the situation. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the ambient sounds of the neighborhood, the distant traffic, the rustle of leaves, the hum of air conditioners, seemed to fade away, leaving only the heavy weight of their mistake hanging in the air. Marcus could see the mental calculations racing through their minds as they reconsidered every word, every gesture, every assumption they had made in the past few minutes. The realization that they had racially profiled their own chief of police was setting in like a slow-moving avalanche. Sullivan's previous bravado had evaporated completely. The rookie officer now looked impossibly young and vulnerable, like a child caught in a terrible misdeed. His eyes darted between his partner and his chief, silently pleading for someone to tell him how to fix this unfixable moment. His police academy training had never covered this scenario. There was no protocol for what to do when you discover you've been treating your own chief of police like a suspicious character. Marcus watched as Brady's professional mask cracked further, revealing the deep-seated fear beneath. Not just fear of professional consequences, but the darker fear of having one's prejudices exposed so nakedly. The veteran officer's hand moved unconsciously to straighten his badge, a nervous gesture that seemed almost ironic given the circumstances. His mouth opened and closed several times, trying to form words that wouldn't come. The patrol car's engine idled quietly behind them, its headlights creating long shadows that stretched across the lawn like accusatory fingers. In the distance, a few neighbors had gathered on their porches, drawn by the unusual spectacle of a police stop in their quiet community. Mrs. Henderson, who had been watching from her window, now stood on her front steps, recognition finally dawning on her face as she realized the jogger was her neighbor of 12 years. The air grew heavier with each passing second. Both officers seemed frozen in place, caught between their training to maintain authority and their overwhelming desire to apologize, to explain, to somehow undo what couldn't be undone. Their eyes kept returning to Marcus's face, searching perhaps for anger, for judgment, but finding only a calm, steady gaze that somehow made the situation even more uncomfortable. Brady's police radio crackled to life with routine chatter, making both officers jump slightly. The sudden noise seemed to break the spell, forcing them back into the reality of their situation. Sullivan shifted his weight from foot to foot, looking like he wanted nothing more than to flee back to the patrol car. Brady's face had settled into a mask of professional devastation, the look of a man watching his career flash before his eyes. The revelation had stripped away more than just their authority. It had exposed the fundamental flaws in their approach to policing, their unconscious biases, and their assumptions about who belongs in which neighborhoods. In this moment, they weren't just facing their chief of police. They were facing their own prejudices, reflected back at them through the lens of undeniable authority. Marcus took a slow, deliberate breath, maintaining his composed demeanor. He had faced similar situations throughout his career, but this one was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every black person who had ever been stopped without cause, every assumption made based on skin color, every moment of prejudice disguised as procedure. The weight of all those moments hung in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable. Marcus Washington stood in the gathering dusk, his running clothes still slightly damp with sweat, and watched as the full impact of the situation settled over his officers. The silence stretched between them like an invisible thread, charged with tension and unspoken revelations. He could have exploded in anger, could have threatened their jobs right there on the spot, but that wouldn't serve the greater purpose. Instead, he chose his next words with the careful precision that had marked his entire career. "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp, my office," Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had earned him respect throughout his 27 years of service. He watched as both officers seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of his words. "We're going to have a comprehensive discussion about what just happened here." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And I want you both to spend tonight thinking about something. How many Marcus Washingtons have you stopped who weren't wearing a chief's badge?" Sullivan's face contorted with shame, while Brady's weathered features showed the dawning horror of self-realization. The veteran officer's eyes darted to the ground, unable to maintain contact with the steady gaze of his superior. The rookie shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado completely evaporated in the face of this moment of reckoning. "I want you to write detailed reports about this incident," Marcus continued, his tone measured and professional. "Not the sanitized version you'd normally file, but the truth. Write down your initial thoughts when you saw me running. Write down your assumptions. Write down every decision that led you to make this stop." He gestured to the quiet, affluent neighborhood around them. "Write down why you thought I didn't belong here." A car passed slowly by, its headlights illuminating the scene briefly. The driver, another of Marcus's neighbors, did a double-take at the tableau before them, two white officers standing awkwardly before a black man in running clothes, their authority visibly diminished. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. This scene could have played out very differently if he hadn't been the chief of police. "When you come to my office tomorrow," Marcus continued, "bring those reports. But more importantly, bring your honesty. We're going to talk about implicit bias. We're going to talk about community policing. We're going to talk about the difference between actual suspicious behavior and assumptions based on skin color." He paused, watching his words land with impact. "And we're going to talk about how to be better officers, better public servants, and better human beings." The evening air had grown cooler, carrying the scent of jasmine from Mrs. Henderson's garden. Marcus could see her still watching from her porch, along with several other neighbors who had gathered to witness the unusual scene. He knew tomorrow there would be conversations throughout the neighborhood, throughout the department. Good. Sometimes change needed witnesses. "This moment?" Marcus gestured between them. "This discomfort you're feeling right now? Don't run from it. Learn from it. Because tomorrow we're going to discuss how many other joggers, fathers, and citizens you might have treated this way who weren't your chief of police. We're going to talk about how many lives have been affected, or ended, because of stops just like this one." Brady's face showed the beginning of understanding, the first cracks in a wall of prejudice built over years of ingrained habits and unexamined assumptions. Sullivan, younger and perhaps more malleable, looked like he was seeing his chosen profession in a new light for the first time. "I'm not doing this to shame you," Marcus added, his voice softening slightly. "I'm doing this because tomorrow we have an opportunity to create real change. One interaction, one officer, one precinct at a time. This stop wasn't just about me, it's about every black person who has ever had to calculate how to look less suspicious, how to move slower, how to seem less threatening just to stay alive." The weight of history hung heavy in the air between them, the weight of countless similar stops, countless similar assumptions, countless lives affected by the very biases these officers had just displayed. Marcus knew that one incident wouldn't change everything, but it could be a start. Sometimes the most powerful lessons came wrapped in the most uncomfortable moments. "Until tomorrow, officers," Marcus said finally, reaching down to adjust his wireless earbud. "I have 2 miles left in my run. And yes," he added with just a hint of emphasis, "I do belong in this neighborhood. I've lived here longer than either of you have worn a badge." As he started jogging again, leaving the officers standing in their shame and revelation, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Tomorrow would be challenging, for them and for him. But maybe, just maybe, this encounter would create ripples of change throughout his department. Sometimes it took seeing yourself clearly in the mirror of your own prejudices to finally begin the work of transformation. Behind him, he could hear the officers slowly returning to their patrol car, their movements heavy with the weight of realization. The sound of their car door closing echoed through the quiet street like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. Tomorrow would bring hard conversations and harder truths, but tonight, seeds of change had been planted in ground made fertile by discomfort and revelation.